I'm Steve Balch, the Director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. I want to welcome you to this rather unusual, special, but extremely interesting matinee performance. We generally don't do matinees, but we're doing one today. And we're doing it to accommodate the schedule of a very special guest here on campus. I've had the delightful opportunity to converse with her earlier today, and I can tell you he's very well worth listening to. He is Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, who has held a number of challenging positions in the United States government. Started his career born in New Jersey, and so I can kind of claim some sort of common bond, at least at that level. Came to Texas at the age of 2, served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, got into Texas politics, was elected to the state legislature, became part of the circle of President George H.W. Bush, went to Washington with President Bush, served on his staff, first when he was vice president, later under Ronald Reagan. He was appointed as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. He later went on, when President Bush was in office, the first President Bush, to be the director of the Voice of America, and then under President George W. Bush, was appointed to the ambassadorship of the strategically located, small, very wealthy, and very interestingly engaged in the politics and diplomacy of the region, Emirate of Qatar, where America has a major military base, where Jazerra is located, and where a lot of other things are going on. I'm told that per capita it's the wealthiest country in the world, at least if you count its citizens rather than all the people who are living there. That's about 300,000 of those very fortunate people. So Qatar is very much in the news. It's the subject of a kind of embargo and ostracism by most of its neighbors. It depends heavily on the United States. And to tell you much more than I could about that, let me give you Ambassador Untermeyer.
Thank you, Dr. Balch. This is, for me, a wonderful day to be introduced to the tech community and to get to talk about a favorite subject, and I hope it's also your favorite subject. What I'd like to do is just give some general remarks and then answer your questions, and for that reason, when are we wrapping up, Dr. Balch?
You can go as long as you like. I think you have to be out here about 3 or 3:15.
Okay. Well, I know I have an audience of people who have other things to do, but I will respect that. First of all, I should say that I am not a career diplomat. I did not rise in the ranks of the American Foreign Service the way that about 2/3 of our ambassadors ever do. In any presidential administration, regardless of party, there is a roughly 2/3, 1/3 split between the 2/3 who are career diplomats, who are very bright people who take the entrance exam. Sometimes they have to take it more than once, be interviewed and be accepted, at which point they begin to rise in rank in the Foreign Service the way military people do, if they are good at their job and get good ratings and good assignments. The other 1/3 are people like myself who came out of the general world of American life. They're called political appointees, but truth to tell, the president names all ambassadors under the Constitution. It's just the 2/3 are the people who rise in ranks and get recommended by the State Department over to the White House, and the other 1/3 are generated within the White House staff in the office that I once headed for the first President Bush, the Office of Presidential Personnel, which has responsibility for a wide range of jobs in the federal system, of which ambassadors are maybe the most sensitive, but by no means the only job to be filled. The people who are non-career ambassadors typically are wealthy people who have given or raised a lot of money for the winning presidential candidate. That's been the case going back many, many presidents. Sometimes they're more, sometimes they're less. Under President Obama, fundraisers or those people who gave a lot of money constituted a large percentage of his non-career ambassadors. For the first President Bush, whom I served, they constituted less because he had many old friends, many other people he knew, and himself, having been an ambassador at one point, knew about the job and knew the kind of people he wanted to fill those. So that's kind of how I came into the picture. It was because I had a long-standing relationship with the Bush family, going back to when I was a college student and volunteered in the Bush for Congress campaign of Father Bush when he ran for Congress in the west side of Houston in 1966. After that, I was an intern in his House staff, kept in touch. When he became vice president, he asked me to come to Washington with him, and that introduced me to the very exciting world that I'd always yearned to join of international relations at a very high level, that with the vice president, either in the West Wing of the White House or traveling around the world, we would meet, he would meet, but I got to tag along some of the great world leaders, and to be able to have that experience as a wonderful way to learn. When I went into the Pentagon a few years later, it was a different kind of education, a chance to see how the Department of Defense actually operates and how things happen or don't happen and how you work with the Congress. Later, when first President Bush became president, I mentioned I did the personnel job, but after that I was director of the Voice of America, having an agency of my own to deal with matters of budget and personnel and congressional relations. But it was one in which, of course, the entire globe was the subject of our mission. And that was a highly satisfying, very exciting period of time as well. But, you know, as they say, live by the sword, die by the sword. People come into political appointments through the process of politics, and they leave just the same. So that when first President Bush was unfortunately defeated for re-election in 1992, he was out of a job and I was out of a job at the same time. In fact, my wife was out of a job as well because she had a political appointment. So, years passed, I returned to Houston, worked in the private sector. At the time, meanwhile, a gentleman named George W. Bush was coming up the political ladder. It was, he was somebody I'd known, of course, over the years because of his father. And when he was governor of Texas, he appointed me chairman of the State Board of Education, which is a very controversial job. Nevertheless, I think it earned me credit that if I was willing to do that, then maybe I could get some later blessing. And that later blessing took place one morning in March of 2004 when I was sitting at my desk at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, and the phone rang, picked it up, and it was the Director of Presidential Personnel, the same job I had had for the first President Bush. Now, because I'd had that first job myself, I knew two things instantly. Number one was that this was a call about a job, because the Director of Presidential Personnel doesn't casually call people around the country to find out how things are going. And I also knew, number two, that it was about an important job because it was the director herself who was calling, not one of the staff. And it was about becoming an ambassador. And I'm compressing things a bit, but I was identified to go to Qatar. Now, Qatar, as Dr. Ball said, is right in the middle of the Persian Gulf. It is a country that where the official language is Arabic, a very difficult language that I did not speak at all. I, in fact, had not even been in that area except very briefly 22 years earlier. So I certainly was not selected because of what they would call regional or cultural knowledge. It was because of other things. Because I'd been director of Voice of America and Al Jazerra, the Arabic language broadcaster, was so important and so sensitive, that was a factor. The fact that the Al Udeid Air Base is located there and contains the forward headquarters of the U.S. Central Command. And because I had been in the Pentagon, that was another plus. The fact that I had worked for a university, and there are 6 American universities, including Texas A&M, located in Qatar. That was another plus. The fact that I had been an elected official in various jobs, and the fact that Qatar was beginning to develop a form of democracy where they were electing members of their municipal council, then that also gave me certain understanding and points of reference that were of value in that job. But most important of all was that I knew the president and the president's father and other members of his family. And in those cultures, having that personal, especially family relationship, is far more valuable than the business of being a scholar in their language or having long experience in that country. So for all those reasons, I was chosen. My name was sent off to the Senate. Eventually, I got confirmed by the Senate in hearings that were nothing like what Mr. Kavanaugh recently went through. In fact, they were marked by being rather routine and boring, but routine and boring is good when it comes to confirmation. And I went off to Doha. When my wife, daughter, and I, and our daughter was almost 11 at the time, stepped off the airplane in Qatar, we knew absolutely nobody in the country. We didn't know an American, we didn't know a Qatari, we didn't know anybody. But that was part of the job. Part of the job was to go out and meet people. And in many ways, being an ambassador, especially in a small country, was not unlike being a state legislator here in Texas, because local politicians are supposed to, and if they're good, they devote themselves to going out and meeting people. You never know enough people, and you can never go to enough events. You can never pass up an opportunity to give a speech to a Rotary Club or give a talk to a class of students and the civics classes in high school or any other kind of thing that comes up. And that's pretty much what the outside the office job of an ambassador is, to go out and make friends for the country, to show a human face. And in a small country where we got to meet a large percentage of the population, a lot got echoed through the family circles. So we didn't get to meet everybody in that very small country, but I'm sure we met somebody who was related to all the other people we did not meet. My wife had a particular beneficial effect on our diplomacy, having nothing to do with foreign policy, with the policies of the Bush administration, or indeed any of the issues I was dealing with every day. And that's because she was very interested in horses. She's from Wyoming. She was always very pro-horse. And when she arrived in Qatar, she discovered the wonderful world of the Arabian horse, which is what I call one of the 3 sacred animals of that part of the world, the other 2 being the camel and the falcon. So Arabian horses quickly found their way into my wife's heart. She got very much involved in what's called endurance racing, which is long-distance horse racing in the desert, goes on for hours, same horse, same rider, and she became a champion. She would get in the sports pages, something I would never do unless I was photographed standing next to her when she received the trophy. So this, which we call equine diplomacy, proved to be a great benefit to the United States. Even our daughter, who we call the ambassador, was of great help because she went to the American School of Doha, which is, as the name suggests, a school along American lines, a private school which was subsidized in a large degree by energy companies and the U.S. government. But there were Qatari students at the American school, and she got to know them and their families, and through my wife's horse connections and the people I met, we got to become acquainted with the country at large. And that was our education. People had asked, well, didn't the State Department prepare you for going to Qatar? And of course they did to a degree. I had access to all kinds of studies and documents and cables of one kind or another, but never did I ever sit in a class and have a learned professor talk to me about Middle Eastern matters or tell me about the history of the country. In fact, it was very hard to find a history of Qatar. There were a few specialty things that have been written about the Bedouins or about the pearl industry that was so important in that part of the world before the discovery of oil. but no one book that told the story. I'm glad to say, incidentally, my wife has subsequently written that book called Qatar, Sand, Sea, and Sky, which is a coffee table book with beautiful photographs of the country, but it's the text that tells about the culture and how the very traditional ancient ways still inform the modern state. The American state of relations with Qatar, as I've indicated, are built upon three principal premises. They start with the energy relationship, in which companies like ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Baker Hughes, Halliburton, many other major American corporations have very big contracts to develop the natural gas resource of Qatar. Qatar was always an oil producer, but not a very big oil producer. Its real wealth comes from natural gas, which is found in the seabed in between it and Iran. The international line goes right through that seabed. Iran has got maybe about a third of it, and Qatar the rest. Qatar has been the only country to actually exploit the gas in the seabed. The Iranians are only now just starting to do it, and the reason is that under their many sanction regimes, they never had the capital to hire the equipment you need to do in-sea drilling, and of course they've had a lot of onshore gas and oil that they've been developing over the years. The liquefied natural gas is pumped from the seabed ashore into gigantic, long factories that are called trains. They have nothing to do with railroads, they're just called trains because of their length. And what occurs in the train is the chilling of that natural gas to minus 261 degrees centigrade, which is cold enough for it to become a liquid, a very condensed, compact liquid that can then be pumped on board some of the world's biggest tankers and then sent all over the world, primarily to East Asia and to Europe. The contracts, as I mentioned, have gone mainly to American companies, although Shell, Total, Eni, and certain other international oil companies have been involved. So that's the number one pillar. The second pillar was the invitation to 6 American universities to operate full-fledged 4-year campuses in Qatar in what's called Education City. This was the initiative of the very impressive, very dazzling wife of the then emir, mother of the current emir, Sheikh Moza bin Nasser, who had a great regard for Western education. Eastern education traditionally has been just rote learning, in which a respected professor would say things and the students were supposed to learn it word for word and give it back on exams exactly as said. But what was missing was so-called critical thinking, in which students are asked, what do you think about, or please explain, or give the reasons for something to be as it is. And that was missing in their traditional forms of education, so Sheikh Moza imported these 6 American universities, each of which has a different specialty. Texas A&M is the School of Engineering, Weill Cornell is the School of Medicine, Georgetown is the School of International Relations, Northwestern is the School of Communications, Carnegie Mellon is the School of Information, Technology, and Business, and the Virginia Commonwealth University is the School of Design, that is graphic, fashion, and interior design. They are fully subsidized by the Qatari people. The universities have to provide the staff and the curriculum and all that goes into running a university, but they are more than compensated by the state through an entity run by Sheikh Moza called the Qatar Foundation. The third pillar is most important, and that is the defense relationship. In 1995, the father of the current emir, Sheikh Hamad, took power from his father in a sort of bloodless coup. In fact, to call it a coup suggests tanks and weapons. This was merely a matter of the son, Sheikh Hamad, saying to his father in so many words, don't bother to show up at the office next week. And he took over the rules of the country, and with his wife and a very talented team of other people, both in the ruling family and outside the ruling family, began to develop the gas resource that provided the immense wealth that allowed Qatar to do things like bring over universities and buy Jazerra and to have a a major presence diplomatically and internationally. The thing that, one of the early things that Sheikh Hamad did was to build a 10,000-foot runway in the desert at a place called Al-Udeid. And it was a classic case of build it and they will come, because he built it on the assumption that the United States Air Force would be highly interested in such an asset in that part of the world. And it happened right at the time that we were invited by the Saudi government to leave Saudi Arabia. So the Qataris were glad to welcome the United States, and here was this 10,000-foot runway. And that is today the heart of the Al-Udeid base, which is a Qatari base, but the United States and coalition forces have been able to use it. And I wonder, among the Air Force personnel here, are there people who've been assigned to or visited Al-Udeid? Ah, God. Looks like we have 40% of our Air Force delegation with that. In the event, it is an amazing asset to the United States. The forward headquarters of the U.S. Central Command also is located on Al-Udeid. It is given to the United States at no cost every year, and perhaps even more valuably, there are no controls, no restrictions upon air operations, which is not what we have from our NATO allies. It's that much more generous, more liberal. The fact that it is such a critical base, and has been from the start of the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is one of the reasons why I found my personal job in the years I was there to be so challenging, because Al Jazeera, which is owned by Qatar but operated by civilian and in many cases non-Qatari journalists, was broadcasting news out of Iraq and Afghanistan that the George W. Bush administration considered to be highly critical and hostile. Now, it was also alleged that it was in league with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. That was because the impact of Al Jazeera throughout the Arabic-speaking world was so great that, of course, Osama bin Laden wanted to use it as his outlet for the diatribes he taped somewhere in the cave and managed to get into the hands of Al Jazeera. I told the management of Al Jazeera, you know, your relations with America would be so much better if you just let somebody else be the first to broadcast this tape from Osama bin Laden. You know, if you're onto the story 30 minutes later, it's still going to be a big story for you, but it won't get you and Qatar in as much trouble. But journalists being as they are, they want to have the scoop, the exclusive. Now, they did absolutely nothing to win this exclusive. It's a tape that came into their hands, but it did have that degree of complication, and I'm sorry to say that it impacted upon the entire relationship, to the point that even though Qatar provided the opportunity for the United States to operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year out of this very crucial airbase, that Qatar was viewed as a hostile force by the administration. There were even efforts to find another base, and who knows what it would have cost to duplicate Al-Udeid and its very critical command structure in another country. But there were serious efforts at extremely senior levels to do exactly that. In the end, it was decided to stay with what we had, namely the Al-Udeid base, and that's the way it's remained to this day, fortunately. And yet, my job was to do something about Al Jazeera, to try to decrease this tension. And while a lot of what I did is still classified, I can tell you that I was working with the senior journalists at Al Jazeera to find ways that their reporting could be made more professional according to international standards, rather than traditional Arab world standards. Arab world standard journalism tended to be very highly emotional and very hyperbolic when it came to the choice of words and images. And the international standard was much cooler, much more nuanced, much more balanced, and that was the level to which we hope to bring Al Jazeera. Now, at no point did I attempt to or imagine that they could become pro-American, pro-war in Iraq or war in Afghanistan, but that wasn't really the issue. The issue was to get to a point where it was not considered to be as a offensive or as stimulative to anti-American attitudes as it had been. And I'm glad to say, and it's a much longer story than I'm sharing with you today, that that standard was reached, and American objections to what Al Jazerra said dropped away to practically nothing. I told my associates in the Bush administration that having done this, I was now ready to work on the Washington Post, on CBS, New York Times, and other places that they found they're reported to be offensive and difficult. But right at the time that Al Jazeera became less of an issue, Qatar decided to exercise its diplomatic muscle and won the so-called Arab seat on the United Nations Security Council. Now, this was a great honor. They got to sit there to be one of only 15 members of the council, but they suddenly realized that when you're on the UN Security Council, you have to vote on things, and you have to vote on things from all over the world. And it became my job, once again, now in a different category, to go talk to the foreign ministry about why they should vote yes on this resolution, no on this other resolution, or some other thing happening anywhere in the world that was far, far beyond the shores of the Persian Gulf. That was a special adventure all by itself. Now, subsequent to my tenure, the Qatari government and the Qatari society has gotten only more engaged, richer, and more engaged in projects of a high order. The most celebrated one being that they sought and secured the right to hold the World Cup in soccer in Qatar in the year 2022, the very next World Cup. Toward that end, they have been building hotels and freeway interchanges and a new airport and a new port facility and so much more infrastructure. I left out the fact they're putting in a metro, a commuter rail system. Nobody quite knows who's going to ride it before or after the World Cup, but they have this state-of-the-art metro. That is why the look of what's happening in Qatar is so impressive and amazing. And you can say the same about their cousin cities of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, also amazing places of magnificent buildings and museums and universities. But I believe that what makes Qatar such an interesting place is that despite its tiny size, it has the ambition and the drive to be a player in regional affairs, indeed in many ways in world affairs, as shown by its desire to be on the Security Council. And that has characterized a great deal of its activity and is also what lies behind a great deal of the irritation against Qatar that has been raised against it by its immediate neighbors, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, Saudi Arabia is by far a bigger country. Qatar has a population of about 2.5 million, of whom only 300,000 are citizens of the country. That's the number that counts. But it has a population of Saudi Arabia of somewhere about the size of Texas, about 25 million people. Nevertheless, Qatar has about 1/3 of the wealth of Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding that great difference in population. Saudi Arabia has many people who are truly poor, or at least hanging on to the middle class, whereas Qatar's population is quite comfortable, to say the least. The United Arab Emirates, right next door, is arguably about as rich as Qatar, because Abu Dhabi is a major oil producer, but it has never had the same ambition that Qatar to play that kind of role, and has been very happy to be a partner with Saudi Arabia in a way that Qatar has not chosen to be a partner. So when we get to June of 2017 and the blockade, the economic blockade, clapped onto Qatar by its neighbors, we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the reasons for this? Why did it get to this point? Well, I pretty much indicated one of the reasons. I would say it's probably number one, and that is Al Jazeera. That is the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, another blockading company, have never liked the fact that Al Jazeera has been reporting on what's going on inside their countries. Now, that reporting may be right or wrong, good or bad. The mere fact that it's happening is something that no centralized government, a dictatorship or totalitarian regime, ever wants to happen. They want to control the news, they want to control the message, and to have an outside force broadcasting something different than what the government wants is always going to be an irritant. I describe it as pulling up the flap of the tent and looking inside and reporting back as to what to find there. And of course, major audiences interested in what Al Jazeera has found about Saudi Arabia are the people of Saudi Arabia. And you can say the same about the Emirates and other places that have much tighter and more closed societies. That is irritation number one. But I think there's another factor, and that is just the ambition, the upstart nature of Qatar seems to irritate the Saudis, who have for many years been the leading power, the leading force in the Gulf, and remain so because of their size and wealth, and will always remain so. But the fact is that here is Qatar, a small appendage to their country and their way of looking at it, that they could have taken over in one afternoon many years ago without anybody particularly noticing or caring. And they didn't, and this is the country that is causing them so much aggravation. The blockade was clapped on because of a list of particulars. Number one was Al Jazeera, but there were some others that deserve discussion. They claim, for example, that Qatar was too close, too chummy with Iran. Now, Iran, as we know, is the great Shia power across the Gulf, and for 5,000 years, Persia has looked upon itself as the natural power of consequence in that part of the world. And, truth to tell, they've looked down upon the Arabs on the other side of the water as being a nomadic people without the same level of learning and artistic expression of statecraft that Persia has established over the eons. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the great Sunni power, as the custodian of the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. In fact, the most important title that the king of Saudi Arabia has is not king of Saudi Arabia, but custodian of the two holy mosques. And that is a kind of intensely emotional and fervent importance attached to Saudi Arabia that can never be discounted. As long as Saudi Arabia has Mecca and Medina, it will be a very powerful country in the world. The one-time oil minister from Saudi Arabia said, one day even we will run out of oil, but we will never run out of Mecca and Medina. And to the degree he's right, he means that the Saudi state will always be very, very impactful. Right now we see proxy wars between the Sunni power and the Shia power going on throughout the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and especially in Yemen, where the Saudis have been waging a very clumsily fought war against the Houthi tribe of Yemen, which is Shia and therefore aligned with Iran. The war has not gone well. Saudi Arabia has come in for a great deal of condemnation because there's been a lot of collateral killing as a result of some of its bombing. At the same time, the Saudis have been unsuccessful in this blockade against Qatar. It seemed to me that the blockade was always going to fail because Qatar is a very small place, and even if you count all 2.5 million people, the wealth of Saudi Arabia is more than enough to take care of those people, and absolutely more than enough to take care of the citizen population, 300,000 who are Qatari. It's an inconvenience, and in that if you want to fly between Doha and Dubai, or Doha and Abu Dhabi, or Doha and Riyadh, you have to go through a third country, like Kuwait or Oman. It's also been a difficulty, in some cases rising to the level of human rights violation, of family separation, when, as has happened over the many years, there are people of Saudi or Emirati nationality who marry people from Qatar. And when the blockade was imposed, some people who may have been visiting relatives in the other country were not allowed to return to Qatar or to leave Qatar and return to the places where they were living. This is very tragic for the families involved, to say the least, but it does not threaten the existence of the Qatari state, and that's why the blockade has been unsuccessful and will continue to be unsuccessful. There's even been a unintended consequence, as there always are, in that the Saudis and the Emiratis very much wanted to undermine the current ruler, Sheikh Tamim, who is the son of Sheikh Hamad and of Sheikh Hamoza, the couple that revolutionized so much of what goes on in Qatar. But Sheikh Tamim is very popular, and in fact, in a society in which pictures of the ruling family were to be found only in the expected places, government office buildings and hotel lobbies, nevertheless, now you see the image of Sheikh Tamim everywhere, on windshields, on motorbikes, on the sides of buildings, in every possible place. There is a stylized image of the ruler that wasn't there before. And that is a way of showing national support for him in resistance to the blockading countries. And that support has extended to the non-citizen population, the vast multitudes of workers who come from Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the rest. So let me wrap this up and start taking questions by saying that America's interest is in patching up this dispute to the degree that we can overcome the irritations that I mentioned. They are deep-seated, they are ongoing. There's no peace conference that can be convened where everybody agrees to hug and kiss and move on. But to the degree that the coalition of Sunni nations and the United States facing Iran is splintered, then that can only help Iran. Also, it is in America's interest to maintain the base at Al-Udeid and to make sure that there are no dangers to the continuation of the Qatari state. And we have an equal stake in the continuation of the regime in Saudi Arabia. It may be noxious to us for its human rights practices and other things it's alleged to do, such as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but we must maintain good ties with Saudi Arabia and to maintain, as best as we are able, the existence of the Saudi regime, because anything after them would only be worse than what we now have. Well, this is a large topic, and I know, wandered here and far, and I want to respect everybody to be able to leave at 3 o'clock. So let me ask for any questions that people have.
Thank you very much.